Section 17 of Heroines Every Child Should Know. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Denise Nordell. Heroines Every Child Should Know, edited by Hamilton Wright MABIE and Kate Stevens. Sister Dora, Part 2. Mr. Samuel Welsh says, I remember one evening I was in the hospital when a poor man who had been dreadfully crushed in a pit was brought in. One of his legs was so fearfully injured that it was thought it would be necessary to amputate it. After examining the patient, the doctor came to me in the committee room, one door of which opened into the passage leading to the wards and another into the hall, in the domestic portion of the building. After telling me about the patient who had just been brought in, he said, "Do you know Sister Dora is very ill? So ill," he continued, "that I question if she will pull through this time." I naturally inquired what she was suffering from, and in reply the doctor said, "She will not take care of herself and is suffering from blood poison." He left me, and I was just trying to solve the problem, what shall be done, or how shall her place be supplied if she be taken from us by death, when I saw a spectral-like figure gliding gently and almost noiselessly through the room from the domestic entrance to the door leading to the wards. The figure was rather indistinct, for it was nearly dark, and as I gazed at the receding form, I said, "Sister, is it you?" "Whist," she said, and glided through the doorway into the wards. In a short time she returned, and I said to her, "Sister, the doctor has just been telling me how ill you are. How is it you are here?" "Ah," replied she, "it is true I am very ill, but I heard the surgeons talking about amputating that poor fellow's limb, and I wanted to see whether or not there was a possibility of saving it, and I believe there is, and knowing that I shall rest better." So saying, she glided as noiselessly out of the room as when she entered. On her recovery, which was retarded by her neglecting herself to attend to others, she called me one day to the hall door of the hospital, and asked me if I thought it was going to rain. I told her I did not think it would rain for some hours. She then told me to go and order a cab to be ready at the hospital in half an hour. I tried to persuade her not to venture out so soon, but it was no use. She went, and many a time I wondered where she went to. About 6 months afterward I happened to be at a railway station, and saw a pointsman who had been in our hospital with an injured foot, but who, as his friends wished to have him at home, had left before his foot was cured. I inquired how his foot was. He replied that had it not been for Sister Dora he would have lost his foot, if not his life. I said, "How did she save your foot when you were not in the hospital, and she was ill at the time you left the hospital?" "Well," he replied, "you know my foot was far from well when I left the hospital. There was no one at our house who could see to it properly, and it took bad ways, and one evening I was in awful pain. Oh, how I did wish for Sister Dora to come and dress it!" I felt sure she could give me relief, but I had been told she was very ill, so I had no hope that my earnest desire would be realized. But while I was thinking and wishing, the bedroom door was gently opened, and a figure just like Sister Dora glided so softly into the room that I could not hear her, but oh, she was so pale that I began to think it must be her spirit, but when she folded the bedclothes from off my foot, I knew it was she. She dressed my foot, and from that hour it began to improve. A few days after this interview with the pointsman, I was talking to Sister Dora, and said, "By the by, sister, I have found out where you went with the cab that day." She replied with a merry twinkle in her eye, "What a long time you have been finding it out!" Her old patients ever remembered her with gratitude. A man called Schell, an engine stoker, was twice in the hospital under her care. First with a dislocated ankle, severely cut. The second time with a leg crushed to pieces in a railway accident. It was amputated. According to his own account, he remembered nothing of the operation, except that Sister Dora was there, and that, "when I come to after the chloroform, she was on her knees by my side, with her arms supporting my head, and she was repeating, 'They climbed the steep ascent of heaven through peril, toil, and pain. O God, to us may grace be given to follow in their train.'" And all through the pain and trouble that I had afterward, I never forgot Sister's voice saying those words. When she was in the smallpox hospital, avoided by most, this man never failed to stump away to it to see her and inquire how she was getting on. There were, as she herself recognized, faults in the character of Sister Dora, and yet without those faults, problematical as it may seem, it is doubtful whether she could have achieved all she did. One who knew her long and intimately writes to me, "A majestic character, brimming over with sympathy, but, for lack of self-discipline, this sympathy was impulsive and gushing. Her glorious nature, physical and mental, was marred by undisciplined impulse. Her nature found its congenial outlet in devoted works of mercy and love to her fellow creatures. How far she would have done the same under authority, I fear, is little doubtful." Miss Twigg, who knew her well, writes me, She was a lovable woman, so bright and winsome. She used to come into our rather dull and sad home (our mother died when we were quite children) after evening service. She would nurse one of us big as we were then, and the others would gather round her while she would tell us stories of her hospital life. She was a real woman. There is one point in Sister Dora's life to which sufficient attention has not been paid by her biographers. It is one which the busy workers of the present day think of too little, namely, the writing of bright, helpful letters to any friend who is sick or in trouble. Somehow or other she always found time for that, wrote one who knew her well, and who contributes the following, written to a young girl who was at the time in a spinal hospital, and was almost a stranger to her. My dear Miss J., I was so glad to hear from you, though I fear it must be a trouble for you to write. I do hope that you will really have benefited by the treatment and rest. I am so glad that the doctor is good to his children. Such little attentions when you are sick help to alleviate wonderfully. I wish I could come and take a peep at you. Did Mrs. N. tell you that she had sent us £5 for our seaside expedition? Was it not good of her? Oh, we shall have such a jolly time. To see all those poor creatures drink in the sea breezes. We have had a very busy week of accidents and operations. It has been a regular storm. My dear, it is in such times as you are now having that the voice of Jesus Christ can be best heard. Come into a desert place a while. Know you surely that it is God's visitation. Take home that thought, realize it, God visiting you. Elizabeth was astonished that the mother of her Lord should visit her. We can have our Emmanuel. I can look back on my sicknesses as the best times of my life. Don't fret about the future. He carrieth our sicknesses and healeth our infirmities. You know infirmity means weakness after sickness. Think of the cheering lines of our hymn, His touch has still its ancient power. When I arose up from my sick bed they told me I should never be able to enter a hospital or do work again. I was fretting over this when a good friend came to me and told me only to take a day's burden and not look forward, and it was such a help. I got up every day feeling sure I should have strength and grace for the day's trial. May it be said of you, dear, they took knowledge of her that she had been with Jesus. May he reveal himself in all his beauty is the prayer of your sincere friend, Sister Dora. It does not truly represent Sister Dora to dwell on her outer life, and not look as well into that which is within, as it was the very mainspring of all her actions, as it, in fact, made her what she was. The same writer to the Guardian gives some sentences from other letters. Take your cross day by day, dearie, and with Jesus Christ bearing the other end it will not be too heavy. If we could find Jesus, it must be on a mountain, not in the plains or smooth places. He went up into a mountain and taught them, saying, etc. It is only on a mountainside that we shall see the cross. It was only after Zacchaeus had climbed the tree he could seek Jesus. I have been thinking much of this lately. It is not in the smooth places we shall see Jesus. It is in the rough, in the storm, or by the sick couch. A Christian is one whose object is Christ. I am rejoiced that you are enjoying Faber's hymns. They always warm me up. Oh, my dear, is it not sad that we prefer to live in the shade when we might have the glorious sunshine? It was during the winter of 1876–77 that Sister Dora felt the first approach of the terrible disease that was to cause her death, and then it was rather by diminution of strength than by actual pain. She consulted a doctor in Birmingham in whom she placed confidence, and he told her the plain truth, that her days in this world were numbered. She exacted from him a pledge of secrecy, and then went on with her work as hitherto. She was suddenly brought, as it were, face to face with death, distant perhaps, but inevitable. She, who was full of such exuberant life and spirit that the very word death seemed a contradiction when applied to her. Even her doctor, as he looked at her blooming appearance, and measured with his eye her finely made form, was almost inclined to believe the evidence of his outward senses against his sober judgment. She could not endure pity. She, to whom everybody had learnt instinctively to turn for help and consolation, on whom others leant for support, must she now come down to ask of them sympathy and comfort? The pride of life was still surging up in her, that pride which had made her glory in her physical strength for its own sake, as well as for its manifold uses in the service of her Master. True, she had been long living two lives inseparably blended, the outward life of hard, unceasing toil, the inner a constant communion with the unseen world, the existence of which she realized to an extent which not even those who saw the most of her could appreciate. To all the poor ignorant beings whose souls she tried to reach by means of their maimed bodies, she was, indeed, the personification of all that they could conceive as lovable, holy, and merciful in the Saviour. At the same time she judged her own self with strict impartiality. She knew her own faults, her unbending will, her pride and glory in her work seemed to her even a fault. And in place of looking on herself as perfect, she was bowed down with a sense of her own shortcomings. At the same time, with death before her, she hungered for more work for her Master. His words were continually on her lips, "I must work the works of him that sent me while it is day, the night cometh when no man can work." At last, in the month of August, 1878, typhoid fever having broken out in the temporary hospital, it was found necessary to close it, and hasten on the work of the construction of another. This gave her an opportunity for a holiday and a complete change. She went to the Isle of Man, to London, and to Paris. But the disorder was making rapid strides, and was causing her intense suffering, and she craved to be back at Walsall. She got as far as Birmingham, and was then in such a critical state that it was feared she would die. But her earnest entreaty was to be taken to Walsall. "Let me die," she pleaded, "among my own people." Mr. Welsh says, "On calling at the Queen's Hotel, Birmingham, where she was lying ill, I was told the doctor of the hospital, Dr. McLaughlin, was with her, and thinking they were probably arranging matters connected with the hospital, I did not go to her room, but proceeded to the train. I had scarcely got seated when the doctor called me out, and we entered a compartment where we were alone. He asked me when it was intended to open the hospital. I replied, on the 4th of November. Then he said that will be just about the same time Sister Dora will die. The announcement was to me a shock of no ordinary kind, for I had not heard of her being ill, and no one could have imagined from the cheerful tone of a letter I had received from her a week or so before that there was anything the matter with her. Not being able to fully realize the true state of affairs, I asked him if he were jesting. He replied he was not, and that he thought it best to let me know at once, so that arrangements might be made for getting someone to take her place when the hospital was opened. I said, "I suppose she is going to Yorkshire?" "No," he replied, "and that is another thing I wish to speak to you about. She wishes to die in Walsall, and she must be removed immediately." On Sunday, the following day, I saw the chairman and vice chairman of the hospital. On Sunday evening I returned with Dr. McLaughlin to the Queen's Hotel, where he found his patient very weak. On Monday morning a house was taken, and the furniture she had in her rooms at the hospital removed to it. Her old servant, who had gone to the Potteries, was telegraphed for, and arrived in a few hours, and by midday the house was ready for her reception. My daughter, knowing Sister Dora's fondness for flowers, had procured and placed on the table in the parlor a very choice bouquet, and when all was ready, Dr. McLaughlin drove over to Birmingham and brought her to Walsall in his private carriage. The disease was now making steady progress, and it was evident that every day she was becoming weaker, but she never lost her cheerfulness, and anyone to have seen her might have thought she was only suffering from some slight ailment, instead of an incurable and painful disease. "A few hours before her death," writes Mr. S. Welch, "she called me to her bedside and said, 'I want you to promise that you will not, when I am gone, write anything about me. Quietly I came among you, and quietly I wish to go away.' And this desire of hers would have been faithfully complied with had not misrepresentations fired the gentleman to whom the request was made to take up his pen, not in defense of her, but in the correction of statements that affected certain persons who were alive. In her last sickness, when she found her end approaching, she insisted on every one leaving the room. It was her wish to die alone. And as she persisted, so was it. Only one nurse standing by the door held ajar, and watching till she knew by the change of attitude, and a certain fixed look in the countenance, that Sister Dora had entered into her rest. It was Christmas Eve when she passed away, and a dense fog, like a funeral pall, hung over the town and obscured every object a few feet from the ground. Under this strange canopy the market was being held, and people were busy buying and selling, and making preparations for the great Christmas festival on the following day. But when the deep boom of the passing bell announced the melancholy intelligence that Sister Dora had entered into her rest, a thrill of horror ran through the people, who, with blanched cheeks and bated breath, whispered, "Can it be true?" Although for 7 weeks the process of dissolution had been going on before their eyes, they could not realize the fact that she whom they loved and revered was no more. The funeral took place on Saturday, the 28th of December. The day was dark and dismal, the streets, covered with slush and sludge caused by the melted snow, were thronged with spectators. There was general mourning in the town, and although it was market day, nearly every shop was closed during the time of the funeral, and all the blinds along the route of the procession were drawn. On reaching the cemetery, it was found that 4 other funerals had arrived from the workhouse, and as these coffins had been taken into the chapel, there was no room for Sister Dora's, which had consequently to be placed in the porch. This was as Sister Dora would have wished, had she had the ordering of the arrangements, for she always gave preference to the poor, to whom she was attached in life, and from whom she would not have desired to be separated in death. True to her thought of others, in the midst of her last sufferings she had made arrangements for a Christmas dinner to be given to a number of her old patients, in accordance with a custom of hers in previous years. But on this occasion the festive proceedings were shorn of their gladness. All thought of her who in her pain and on her deathbed had thought of them. Everyone tried, but ineffectually, to cheer and comfort the other, but the task was hopeless. One young lady, after the meal, and while the Christmas tree was being lighted, commenced singing the pretty little piece, Far Away. But when she came to the words, Some are gone from us forever, longer here they could not stay, she burst into tears, and the women present sobbed. And tears were seen stealing down the cheeks of bearded men. The Walsall writer of A Review concludes his paper thus: "She is no idol to us, but we worship her memory as the most saintly thing that was ever given us. Her name is immortalized both by her own surpassing goodness and by the love of a whole people for her, a love that will survive through generations and give a magic and a music to those simple words, 'Sister Dora,' long after we shall have passed away. There was little we could ever do, there was nothing she would let us do, to relieve the self-imposed rigors of her life, but we love her in all sincerity, and now in our helplessness we find a serene joy in the knowledge that it is to her, as surely as to any human soul, will be spoken the divine words, 'Inasmuch as ye have done it unto the least of these my brethren, ye have done it unto me.' In Sister Dora surely we have the highest type of the Christian life, the inner and hidden life of the soul, the life that is hid in God, combined with that outer life devoted to the doing of good to suffering and needy humanity. In the cloistered nun we see only the first, and that tends to become self-centered and morbid. It is redeemed from this vice by an active life of self-sacrifice. I cannot do better than, in conclusion, quote from the last letter ever penned by Sister Dora. It is 2:30 a.m. and I cannot sleep, so I am going to write to you. I was anything but forbearing, dear. I was overbearing, and I am truly sorry for it now. I look back on my life and see nothing but leaves. Oh, my darling, let me speak to you from my deathbed and say, watch in all you do that you have a single aim, God's honor and glory. I came not to work my own work, but the works of Him that sent me. Look upon working as a privilege. Do not look upon nursing in the way they do so much nowadays, as an art or science, but as work done for Christ. As you touch each patient, think it is Christ Himself, and then virtue will come out of the touch to yourself. I have felt that myself when I have had a particularly loathsome patient. Be full of the glad tidings, and you will tell others. You cannot give what you have not got. End of section 17. Recording by Denise Nordell, Modesto, California. Section 18 of Heroines Every Child Should Know. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Denise Nordell. Heroines Every Child Should Know, edited by Hamilton Wright MABIE and Kate Stevenson. Chapter 13. Florence Nightingale. Day unto day her dainty hands make life's soiled temples clean, and there's a wake of glory where her spirit pure hath been. At midnight through the shadow land her living face doth gleam, the dying kiss her shadow, and the dead smile in their dream. Gerald Massey. Some years ago, when the celebrated Florence Nightingale was a little girl, living at her father's home, a large old Elizabethan house with great woods about it, in Hampshire, there was one thing that struck everybody who knew her. It was that she seemed to be always thinking what she could do to please or help anyone who needed either help or comfort. She was very fond, too, of animals, and she was so gentle in her way that even the shyest of them would come quite close to her and pick up whatever she flung down for them to eat. There was, in the garden behind the house, a long walk with trees on each side, the abode of many squirrels, and when Florence came down the walk, dropping nuts as she went along, the squirrels would run down the trunks of their trees, and, hardly waiting until she passed by, would pick up the prize and dart away, with their little bushy tails curled over their backs, and their black eyes looking about as if terrified at the least noise, though they did not seem to be afraid of Florence. Then there was an old gray pony named Peggy, past work, living in a paddock, with nothing to do all day long but to amuse herself. Whenever Florence appeared at the gate, Peggy would come trotting up and put her nose into the dress pocket of her little mistress, and pick it of the apple or the roll of bread that she knew she would always find there, for this was a trick Florence had taught the pony. Florence was fond of riding, and her father's old friend, the clergyman of the parish, used often to come and take her for a ride with him when he went to the farm cottages at a distance. As he had studied medicine when a young man, he was able to tell the people what would do them good when they were ill or had met with an accident. Little Florence took great delight in helping to nurse those who were ill, and whenever she went on these long rides she had a small basket fastened to her saddle, filled with something nice which she saved from her breakfast or dinner, or carried for her mother. There lived in one of 2 or 3 solitary cottages in the wood an old shepherd of her father's named Roger, who had a favorite sheep dog called Cap. Roger had neither wife nor child, and Cap lived with him and kept him company at night after he had penned his flock. Cap was a very sensible dog; indeed, people used to say that he could do everything but speak. He kept the sheep in wonderfully good order, and thus saved his master a great deal of trouble. One day as Florence and her old friend were out for a ride, they came to a field where they found the shepherd giving his sheep their night feed, but he was without the dog, and the sheep knew it, for they were scampering in every direction. Florence and her friend noticed that the old shepherd looked very sad, and they stopped to ask what was the matter, and what had become of his dog. "Oh," said Roger, "Cap will never be of any more use to me. I'll have to hang him, poor fellow, as soon as I go home tonight." "Hang him!" said Florence. "Oh, Roger, how wicked of you! What has dear old Cap done?" "He has done nothing," replied Roger, "but he will never be of any more use to me, and I cannot afford to keep him for nothing. One of the mischievous schoolboys throwed a stone at him yesterday and broke one of his legs." And the old shepherd's eyes filled with tears, which he wiped away with his shirt sleeve. Then he drove his spade deep in the ground to hide what he felt, for he did not like to be seen crying. "Poor Cap," he sighed, "he was as knowing almost as a human being." "But are you sure his leg is broken?" asked Florence. "Oh yes, miss, it is broken safe enough. He has not put his foot to the ground since." Florence and her friend rode on without saying anything more to Roger. "We will go and see poor Cap," said the vicar. "I don't believe the leg is really broken. It would take a big stone and a hard blow to break the leg of a big dog like Cap." "Oh, if you could cure him, how glad Roger would be," replied Florence. They soon reached the shepherd's cottage, but the door was fastened, and when they moved the latch such a furious barking was heard that they drew back, startled. However, a little boy came out of the next cottage and asked if they wanted to go in, as Roger had left the key with his mother. So the key was got and the door opened, and there on the bare brick floor lay the dog, his hair disheveled and his eyes sparkling with anger at the intruders. But when he saw the little boy he grew peaceful, and when he looked at Florence and heard her call him "poor Cap," he began to wag his short tail, and then crept from under the table and lay down at her feet. She took hold of one of his paws, patted his old rough head, and talked to him, whilst her friend examined the injured leg. It was dreadfully swollen, and hurt very much to have it examined, but the dog knew it was meant kindly, and though he moaned and winced with pain, he licked the hands that were hurting him. "It's only a bad bruise, no bones broken," said her old friend. "Rest is all Cap needs. He will soon be well again." "I am so glad," said Florence, "but can we do nothing for him? He seems in such pain." "There is one thing that would ease the pain and heal the leg all the sooner, and that is plenty of hot water to foment the part." Florence struck a light with the tinder box and lighted the fire, which was already laid. She then set off to the other cottage to get something to bathe the leg with. She found an old flannel petticoat hanging up to dry, and this she carried off and tore up into strips, which she wrung out in warm water and laid them tenderly on Cap's swollen leg. It was not long before the poor dog felt the benefit of the application, and he looked grateful, wagging his little stump of a tail in thanks. On their way home they met the shepherd coming slowly along with a piece of rope in his hand. "Oh, Roger," cried Florence, "you are not to hang poor old Cap. His leg is not broken at all." "No, he will serve you yet," said the vicar. "Well, I am main glad to hear it," said the shepherd, "and thanks to you for going to see him." On the next morning Florence was up early, and the first thing she did was to take 2 flannel petticoats to give to the poor woman whose skirt she had torn up to bathe Cap. Then she went to the dog and was delighted to find the swelling of his leg much less. She bathed it again, and Cap was as grateful as before. 2 or 3 days afterward Florence and her friend were riding together when they came up to Roger and his sheep. This time Cap was watching the sheep, though he was lying quite still and pretending to be asleep. When he heard the voice of Florence speaking to his master, who was portioning out the usual food, his tail wagged and his eyes sparkled, but he did not get up, for he was on duty. The shepherd stopped his work, and as he glanced at the dog with a merry laugh, said, "Do look at the dog, miss. He be so pleased to hear your voice." Cap's tail went faster and faster. "I be glad," continued the old man, "I did not hang him. I be greatly obliged to you, miss, and the vicar, for what you did. But for you I would have hanged the best dog I ever had in my life." This child, Florence Nightingale, of whom the foregoing story is told, was born in Florence, Italy, in 1820. Her parents were English, and her early years were given to the studies which a girl fortunately situated would follow. She was taught in science and mathematics as well as in the fluent use of French, German, and Italian. But from the day the little girl nursed the leg of the shepherd's dog, it became the custom of the neighborhood where she lived to send for her when anyone had a cut or bruise or sick animal. During her girlhood, says the lady who has written her life, she was chief almoner to the cottages around her home and nursed all illnesses under the advice of her mother and the vicar. Her favorite books were those that taught of helpfulness to the suffering and miserable, and it seemed as if her whole nature was turning toward her great work. While still a young girl, she became interested in what Elizabeth Fry had done in English prisons, and she paid an interested visit to Mrs. Fry. When in London she would visit hospitals and kindred institutions, and it is said that in the family travels in Egypt she nursed to health several sick Arabs. Her tastes and time, it is evident, were turned toward a humane and benevolent rather than a social life. Thus passed the years of her younger womanhood. She had withdrawn from gaieties to learn whatever she could of the hospitals of London, Edinburgh, and Dublin, and indeed of the civil and military hospitals of all Europe, and finally, in 1851, she went into training as a nurse in a famous institution at Kaiserwerth on the Rhine. Here, when she had taken the course of instruction, she passed a distinguished examination. After a short period of further study in Paris, she returned to her beautiful English home for rest. But at this time a hospital and home in London for sick and aged governesses was about to fail from lack of means and lack of able direction. To this Miss Nightingale gave herself with ardor, and so renewed its strength that it still remains a witness to her energy. She gave largely to this institution. Nevertheless, she was to be found, says a visitor, organizing the nurses, attending to the correspondence, prescriptions, and accounts, in short, performing all the duties of a hard-working matron. 10 years she had been serving apprenticeship for the great work of her life, and now she was 34 years old. In 1854 a war broke out between England and Russia. It is known as the Crimean War. England sent her soldiers to the Black Sea in many thousands. These soldiers were sadly clad and fed. Bad management seems to have prevailed, and the service for carrying supplies was inadequate. Warm clothing, blankets, tents, and other protection failed to reach the troops. What a mockery, says one writer, it must have seemed to the poor fellows, who with scanty rations and in threadbare and tattered clothes were enduring the most cruel fatigues, aggravated by wind and rain and snow and cold, upon the bleak heights of the Tauric Chersonese, to hear comforts had been sent them. When men of courageous mould have been seen to weep, as on night after night, succeeding days of starvation and toil, they were ordered to their work in freezing trenches, who can estimate the exhausting misery they had at first endured? "It is now pouring rain," wrote another who was there. "The skies are black as ink. The wind is howling over the staggering tents. The trenches are turned into dikes. In the tents the water is sometimes a foot deep. Our men have not either warm or waterproof clothing. They are out for 12 hours at a time in the trenches. They are plunged into the inevitable miseries of a winter campaign, and not a soul seems to care for their comfort, or even for their lives. The wretched beggar who wanders about the streets of London in the rain leads the life of a prince compared with the British soldiers who are fighting out here for their country. The commonest accessories of a hospital are wanting. There is not the least attention paid to decency or cleanliness. The fetid air can barely struggle out to taint the atmosphere, save through the chinks in the walls and roofs, and for all I can observe these men die without the least effort being made to save them. There they lie, just as they were let gently down on the ground by the poor fellows their comrades, who brought them on their backs from the camp with the greatest tenderness, but who are not allowed to remain with them. The sick appear to be tended by the sick, and the dying by the dying." During that winter of 1854 many were frozen in their tents. Of nearly 45,000, over 18,000 were reported in the hospitals. The English people at last saw their disaster, and certain women volunteered services of helpfulness. The head of the War Department of the Government, who knew of Miss Nightingale's interest in nursing, asked her to superintend and organize a staff of nurses. By a strange coincidence, Florence Nightingale had written and offered her aid to the sick and wounded soldiers, and her letter passed the letter from the Government. It was an undertaking wholly new to English habits, a band of devoted women going to soften the horrors of war and save lives the war had endeavored to end. As the nurses landed at Boulogne in France, the poor fisherwomen seized and carried their baggage in token of their admiration for the work they were starting out to do. And in their journey through France, the innkeepers would not take pay for their lodgings and food. They sailed across the Mediterranean, and in November 1854 reached Scutari, a town in Turkey in Asia, opposite Constantinople. 4,000 sick and wounded soldiers lay in hospitals awaiting their ministrations, and still others from a great battle were coming in. These hospitals were so filled that even in the corridors were 2 rows of mattresses, and so close together that 2 persons could barely walk between the rows. The beds reeked with infection. There was no thought, seemingly, of sanitation. Rather than curers, the hospitals were breeders of pestilence. "The whole of yesterday one could only forget one's own existence," wrote one of the nurses, "for it was spent first in sewing the men's mattresses, and then in washing them, and assisting the surgeons when we could, in dressing their ghastly wounds after their 5 days' confinement on board ship, during which space hundreds of wounds had not been dressed. Hundreds of men with fever, dysentery, and cholera (the wounded were the smaller portion) filled the wards in succession from the overcrowded transports. Such were the conditions this band of women found." The head of the band, Miss Nightingale, began her work of organization. She labored with tireless energy and indomitable will. But not without opposition. "The military and medical officials," says one who was there, "were in the uttermost confusion among themselves, and they generally regarded these gentle missionaries as a new element of anarchy." As soon as the wounded soldiers had had treatment, Miss Nightingale set in active operations a kitchen where food fit for the sick might be prepared. Many hundreds of the invalids could not eat of ordinary food without serious evil results. In this kitchen the nurses cooked nourishing delicacies for the poor fellows. The following is a little snapshot by one who was there: "In the outer room we caught a glimpse of the justly celebrated Miss Nightingale, an amiable and highly intelligent looking lady, delicate in form and prepossessing in appearance. Her energies were concentrated for the instant in the careful preparation of a dish of delectable food for an enfeebled patient, one of her homely ministrations to the wan victims of relentless war." After the kitchen the master or mistress mind planned a laundry where the clothing and beds of the sick men might be cleansed. Miss Nightingale, you see, merely organized and conducted housekeeping upon a giant scale. Then in addition she set on foot evening lectures for the men able to listen, and a library, and a schoolroom. Nevertheless she gave distinct and individual service. "I believe," wrote one, "that there never was a severe case of any kind that escaped her notice, and sometimes it was wonderful to see her at the bedside of a patient who had been admitted perhaps but an hour before, and of whose arrival one would hardly have supposed it possible she could already be cognizant." As her slender form glided quietly along each corridor, every poor fellow's face softens with gratitude at the sight of her, wrote another. "When all the medical officers have retired for the night, and silence and darkness have settled down on the miles of prostrate sick, she may be observed alone with a little lamp in her hand, making her solitary rounds. No one who has observed her fragile figure and delicate health can avoid misgivings lest these should fail. With the heart of a true woman and the manners of a lady she combines a surprising calmness of judgment and promptitude and decision of character." "To see her pass was happiness," one poor fellow said. "As she passed down the beds she would nod to one and smile at many more, but she could not do it to all, you know. We lay there by hundreds, but we could kiss her shadow as it fell, and lay our heads upon the pillows again, content." "The magic of her power over men used often to be felt," wrote Kinglake the historian, "in the room, the dreaded, the blood-stained room, where operations took place. There perhaps the maimed soldier, if not yet resigned to his fate, might at first be craving death rather than meet the knife of the surgeon. But when such a one looked and saw that the honored lady in chief was patiently standing by him, and, with lips closely set and hands folded, decreeing herself to go through the pain of witnessing pain, he used to fall into the mood of obeying the silent command, and, finding strange support in her presence, bring himself to submit and endure." Every fresh detachment of the wounded meant fresh work for the band of devoted women. Miss Nightingale was always among the busiest, and she was known to stand for 20 hours assisting at operations, directing nurses, herself ministering to cholera and fever patients, and distributing stores. Once she was prostrated by a fever for some weeks. Illness also attacked others of the nurses, and many were laid in quiet graves in that distant land. At last the fighting was brought to an end. For a year and a half had the noble and humane work of nursing gone on and shown the world how much greater is the saving of lives than the destruction of lives by the murder of war. The gratitude the English people felt for what the nurses had done they expressed by a gift of £50,000 to Miss Nightingale after her return to England. They had planned also a public welcome of their heroine, but with the modesty and calm judgment that always characterized her, she slipped quietly into England by the carriage of a French steamer, and so to her country home. Queen Victoria, who with her husband the Prince Consort had most earnestly admired Miss Nightingale's course, had sought direct knowledge of her work during her stay in the East, entertained her at Balmoral, and presented her with a valuable jewel. The sum presented her by the nation was, at her request, given to the foundation of a training home for nurses in connection with St. Thomas's Hospital. It is called the Nightingale Home. This "Angel of the Crimea" returned to England so enfeebled with arduous labor that she has never since entered active life. She lived many years, perforce, in her own sick room, with scarcely strength to pen a letter, and saw no one but closest associates. The knowledge and experience she had got in public service, however, she gave to the world in part in her Notes on Nursing and Notes on Hospitals, and other publications. Several governments have sought her advice upon the sanitation of army camps, and the Red Cross Society is in part from her aid and endeavor. Her Notes on Nursing are full of sound sense, and we should be more fortunate if the knowledge in them were more general than it is. Everything you do in a patient's room after he is put up for the night increases tenfold the risk of his having a bad night. But if you rouse him up after he has fallen asleep, you do not risk, you secure him a bad night. Conciseness and decision are above all things necessary with the sick. Let your doubt be to yourself, your decision to them. Above all, leave the sick room quietly, and come into it quietly, not suddenly, not with a rush. Remember never to lean against, sit upon, or unnecessarily shake the bed upon which a patient lies. "An extraordinary fallacy is the dread of night air," she wrote. "What air can we breathe at night but night air? The choice is between pure night air from without and foul night air from within. Most people prefer the latter, an unaccountable choice. What will they say if it be proved true that fully one half of all the disease we suffer from is occasioned by people sleeping with their windows shut? An open window most nights of the year can never hurt anyone. In great cities night air is often the best and purest to be had in the 24 hours. The 5 essentials for healthy houses," she again says, "are pure air, pure water, efficient drainage, cleanliness, and light. I have known whole houses and hospitals smell of the sink. I have met just as strong a stream of sewer air coming up the back staircase of a grand London house from the sink as I have ever met at Scutari. And I have seen the rooms in that house all ventilated by open doors, and the passages all unventilated by the closed windows, in order that as much of the sewer air as possible might be conducted into and retained in the bedrooms. It is wonderful." She is opposed to dark houses, says they promote scrofula, to old papered walls, and to carpets full of dust. An uninhabited room becomes full of foul air soon, and needs to have windows open often. She would keep sick people or well forever in the sunlight if possible, for sunlight is the greatest possible purifier of the atmosphere. "In the unsunned sides of narrow streets," she writes, "there is degeneracy and weakliness of the human race, mind and body equally degenerating. Oh, the crowded school where so many children's epidemics have their origin, what a tale its air test would tell." Nursing is an art, and if it is to be made an art, requires as exclusive a devotion, as hard a preparation, as any painter's or sculptor's work. For what is the having to do with dead canvas or cold marble, compared with having to do with the living body, the temple of God's Spirit? Nursing is one of the fine arts. I had almost said the finest of the fine arts. Miss Nightingale is living with her great work done. Still she continues and will ever continue her ministrations in the bravery, devotion, and unselfishness of every nurse and in the effective work of every hospital. Santa Filomena, by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Whene'er a noble deed is wrought, whene'er is spoken a noble thought, our hearts in glad surprise to higher levels rise. The tidal wave of deeper souls into our inmost being rolls, and lifts us unawares out of all meaner cares. Honor to those whose words or deeds thus help us in our daily needs, and by their overflow raise us from what is low. Thus thought I, as by night I read of the great army of the dead, the trenches cold and damp, the starved and frozen camp, the wounded from the battle plain in dreary hospitals of pain, the cheerless corridors, the cold and stony floors. Lo, in that house of misery a lady with a lamp I see, pass through the glimmering gloom, and flit from room to room. And slow, as in a dream of bliss, the speechless sufferer turns to kiss her shadow as it falls upon the darkening walls. As if a door in heaven should be opened and then closed suddenly. The vision came and went, the light shone and was spent. On England's annals through the long hereafter of her speech and song, that light its rays shall cast from the portals of the past. A lady with a lamp shall stand in the great history of the land, a noble type of good, heroic womanhood. Nor even shall be wanting here the palm, the lily, and the spear, the symbols that of yore Saint Philomena bore. Footnotes. In her Sacred and Legendary Art, Mrs. Jameson writes that at Pisa the Church of San Francisco contained a chapel dedicated to Santa Filomena. Over the altar is a picture by Sabatelli, representing the saint as a beautiful nymph-like figure floating down from heaven, attended by two angels, bearing the lily, palm, and javelin, and beneath, in the foreground, the sick and maimed who are healed by her intercession. Longfellow gave the name Philomena to Florence Nightingale partly because of her labors among the sick and dying at Scutari, and partly on account of the resemblance between Philomena and the Latin Philomena, nightingale. Brewer. End of section 18. Recorded by Denise Nordell, Modesto, California. End of Heroines Every Child Should Know, edited by Hamilton Wright Mabie and Kate Stevens.